The massacre in Newtown, Connecticut may serve as the tipping point in the debate over gun control in America. During President Barack Obama's first term, despite mass shootings in Arizona, Colorado, and Wisconsin, not to mention record-high gun-related deaths in the president's home city of Chicago, gun control was not at the top of the White House agenda. 21 murdered children at Sandy Hook Elementary School certainly changed that. Earlier this week, President Obama released his proposals on how to curb gun violence in the United States. The president has called on Congress to act on his proposals. For more on these proposals, we were joined earlier today by Roger Pilon. Roger's the director at the Center for Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute, and he joined us from Washington, D.C.
There are 23 in number, but you look at them closely, and they include such things as appointing a director to the Bureau of Alcohol, Firearms, and Tobacco and Explosives, asking the CDC to do some studies, urging the federal agencies to do more data sharing, and so forth. None of the big stuff was included in that, and rightly so, because what he is proposing has to be done by executive direction, not by legislation. The legislation is where the tough slog is going to take place.
Does that executive direction have a place in the debate on gun control? Because we're talking about part of the Bill of Rights here, the Second Amendment first and foremost here. So how can executive direction even have a place in this debate?
Executive direction is designed mainly to do the small details that the legislature doesn't address and shouldn't address because it's too minor. I mean, everything from parking spaces to secretarial services and so on and so forth. When you get into policy, there is some room for administrative action of the kind that he took. But when it gets too large, like, for example, banning assault weapons, that has to be done through legislation.
Is this the beginning of that, though? In order to have a real and substantive action in this gun control situation, doesn't executive direction have to be the starting point?
Oh, well, no. It's just tinkering around the edges. If we're going to address this issue seriously, there are three areas, and one of them is to focus on the guns. The next is to focus on the mental health aspect, and the third, and the one that's going to accomplish the most, is to proceed with various self-help measures like putting armed guards in schools and other places that are heretofore so-called gun-free zones. It seems to me that that is the most effective way to address this problem of random mass shootings.
The president's appeal to Congress to act on his proposals, will that have any impact on the situation you just so clearly laid out?
Not likely. I mean, for example, take a move to ban assault weapons. First of all, the definition of assault weapon is anything but clear. Many of the guns that people use for hunting today can be classified as assault weapon depending on how you define it. Secondly, assault weapons, even if you could define it, are rarely used in these kinds of shootings. Most of the criminal gun use in the country today is done with pistols, and so that wouldn't address this at all. Then you get to the issue of the proposed ban on magazines, large volume magazines. The idea is that you could allow the sale of only 10-round magazines as opposed to, say, 30-round magazines. Well, that is just deluding yourself because it takes about 2 seconds to change a magazine. So it's sort of like Mayor Bloomberg banning 32-ounce sodas. So you go buy two 16-ounce sodas and it comes to the same thing. It doesn't take long to switch from one soda bottle to the other or from one gun magazine, or rather bullet magazine, to the other. And so this is the kind of proposal you get from people who don't really understand anything about guns.
Well, not only that, Mr. Pilon, but for a lot of people looking at this situation, they think that just because the president says he's going to do something, that he can do something. But based on the framework or the division of power in U.S. government, it's not that simple, is it?
No, of course not. We have a division of powers between the federal and state governments, and then a separation of powers between the three branches. The idea of James Madison, when he drafted the Constitution, was to pit power against power. People complain about the gridlock in Washington today. Well, that's exactly what the founders wanted. They were concerned about too much government. about overweening government of the kind that we have, the Leviathan in Washington today. So they separated power and divided power just to keep power from getting out of hand. So the idea that so many people have today that we live under a government in which the president says do this and everybody snaps to it is just so far removed from what our Constitution is really all about.
Mr. Pilon, that system of checks and balance, which is what the Constitution really amounts to, when you look at it in this light, does that mean that effective government that can have impactful legislation is almost impossible to accomplish?
No, it means that you've got to have a fairly strong consensus in order to get anything through. You've got to have both houses of Congress passed by a majority. You've got to have the president on board, and then you've got to write it in such a way that the court will not overturn it because it's inconsistent with the Constitution. If the president is on board, it goes back to the Congress, and then by a two-thirds vote, it's got to be passed. So you can get things through, but you've got to have a fairly strong consensus behind you in order to do that. And again, the founders set it up that way because they didn't want government regulating every aspect of our life the way we have today. And the reason we have that today is because we had, during the New Deal, the massive vote for one party, and a lot got through, and then Roosevelt threatened to attack the court in 1937 with 6 new members, cowed the court into essentially stepping aside, and we got the kind of regulatory and redistributive state pouring through in 1937, 1938 that has grown ever since. First of all, with Johnson's Great Society, then the Nixon administration contributed as well. And, of course, under Obama today, with Obamacare, we have a massive government program that is only beginning to get started. So check back in a few years and you'll see where we stand.
That was Roger Pilon, director of the Center for Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute. Roger joined us earlier via Skype from Washington, D.C.